He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully traded the boring wife who built his empire for the shiny, younger model who looked good on a yacht. But arrogance has a funny way of blinding men like Richard Sterling. When he walked into the biggest charity gala of the New York season with his mistress on his arm, he expected envy. He expected applause. What he didn't expect was for the entire room to fall silent for a woman he didn't even recognize until she looked him dead in the eye. This isn't just a story about a breakup, it's a masterclass in revenge. Let's find out what happens when the plain ex-wife returns not to make a scene, but to take the throne. Richard Sterling adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, a gift from his new fiancée Tiffany, and looked at himself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of his penthouse. The reflection stared back, a man of 48 who could pass for 38, thanks to a strict regimen of kale smoothies, personal trainers, and the terrifyingly expensive dermatologists on the Upper East Side. He felt good. No, he felt validated. 3 years ago, his life had been a suffocating blanket of beige. He had been married to Catherine for 20 years. Catherine, who wore sensible shoes. Catherine, whose idea of a wild Friday night was ordering Thai food and falling asleep during a documentary about bees. She had been the perfect wife for the struggling architect he used to be. Frugal, supportive, invisible. But Richard wasn't a struggling architect anymore. He was the CEO of Sterling and Hearth, the firm responsible for the new skyline of Manhattan. He needed a partner who shined. He needed someone who matched the jagged chrome aesthetic of his new life. He looked over his shoulder. "Tiffany, darling, the car is downstairs. We can't be late. The press line closes at 8. Tiffany emerged from the walk-in closet, and the room seemed to shrink. She was 24, a former swimsuit model, with a laugh that could shatter glass, and a body that Richard treated like a leased Ferrari. She was wearing a dress that left very little to the imagination, a sheer, sequined red number that screamed for attention. "Does this look okay, Richie?" she asked, pouting as she adjusted a strap. "I feel like the neckline is too high." "It's perfect," Richard lied smoothly. In truth, it was a bit much for the deceptively conservative nature of the Met's Fall Gala. But he didn't care. He wanted to show her off. He wanted his peers, men like Harrison Cole and the old money vampires of the board, to see that Richard Sterling was still a virile, dominant force. He checked his watch. "Let's go. Tonight is important. I'm announcing the Dubai project." As they descended in the private elevator, Richard's mind drifted briefly to Catherine. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. It had been clinical. Brutal, if he was honest, but necessary. He had offered her the house in Connecticut and a decent alimony, provided she stayed away from the press. She had signed the papers without a word. No tears, no screaming match, no throwing of vases. She had simply sat there in her oversized grey cardigan, looking tired and washed out, her hair pulled back in that severe, unflattering bun she always wore. "I just want it over, Richard," she had said softly. He remembered feeling a distinct lack of guilt. She had let herself go. She had stopped trying. While he was climbing mountains, she was content to sit at base camp. He had outgrown her. It was simple evolution. "Richie, are you listening to me?" Tiffany snapped her gum, pulling him back to the present. "Sorry, darling. Just thinking about business." "Well, stop it. Tonight is about us," she said, checking her makeup in the reflective elevator doors. "Do you think the Kardashians will be there?" Richard suppressed a sigh. "I imagine so." The car, a sleek black Maybach, was waiting. As they slid into the leather interior, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a text from his lawyer, Beatrice. "Heads up. I'm hearing rumors that the foundation has a new primary donor. Someone bought the platinum table. Make sure you charm them. We need their vote for the Dubai expansion." Richard frowned. The platinum table at the fall gala cost $500,000 just to sit at. Usually, it was reserved for the ancient families, the Rockefellers, the Astors, or some tech billionaire trying to buy class. "Trouble?" Tiffany asked, scrolling through Instagram. "Just politics," Richard muttered, pocketing the phone. "Someone new is playing the game. Doesn't matter. No one outplays me." He believed it. He had stripped Catherine of her shares in the company during the divorce, arguing that she had contributed nothing to the business. The judge had agreed. Catherine had walked away with cash, but no power. Richard was the king of his castle. But as the car merged onto Fifth Avenue, Richard felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. It was the same feeling he used to get when a building foundation wasn't quite right. A subtle vibration that warned of a collapse. He shook it off. Catherine was probably in Connecticut right now, knitting a sweater or watching a rerun of a baking show. She was the past. Tonight was the future. The red carpet was a battlefield of flash bulbs and shouting. "Richard! Over here! Richard! Who are you wearing? Tiffany, give us a spin!" Richard soaked it in. He placed a possessive hand on Tiffany's waist, guiding her through the gauntlet. She preened, blowing kisses to the cameras, soaking up the attention like a sponge. Richard noticed, however, the slight curling of lips among the society reporters. They were judging her. Too loud, their eyes said. Too new. He stiffened. Let them judge. He had money. Money eventually bought acceptance. They entered the great hall, which had been transformed into a winter garden of white roses and crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Richard scanned the room, nodding to allies and ignoring rivals. "Richard, darling." It was heavy perfume and a cloud of purple silk. Mrs. Van Doren, the chairwoman of the Gala and the gatekeeper of New York society, glided toward them. She kissed Richard on both cheeks, but offered Tiffany a smile so cold it could have frozen vodka. "And this must be Tiffany," Mrs. Van Doren said, pausing as if the name tasted sour. "Charming dress. Very spirited." "Thanks," Tiffany beamed, missing the insult entirely. "It's custom." "I can tell," Mrs. Van Doren said dryly. She turned back to Richard. "We were surprised to see you on the list, Richard. We heard you might be skipping this year. After the transition." "Life goes on, Eleanor," Richard said smoothly. Catherine preferred the quiet life. "I prefer to be where the action is." "Indeed." Mrs. Van Doren's eyes twinkled with something malicious. "Well, you certainly are in for some action tonight. The mystery donor for the platinum table has just arrived. The board is quite buzzed. Apparently they represent a European consortium interested in sustainable architecture." Richard's ears perked up. Sustainable architecture was his firm's weak point. If he could woo this donor, he could secure the Dubai contract and crush his competition. "Is that so? Point them out to me later." "Oh, you won't miss her," Mrs. Van Doren said, drifting away. "She's making an entrance." Richard grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed half of it. He needed to be sharp. "Richie, I'm bored," Tiffany whined, tugging on his arm. "Let's go find our seats. My heels are killing me." "In a minute," Richard snapped, his eyes scanning the grand staircase. The noise level in the hall began to change. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a ripple. It started near the entrance doors, a hush that spread like a wave, moving inward. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Even the string quartet seemed to falter for a beat. "What's going on?" Tiffany asked, looking around. "Is it Beyoncé?" Richard followed the gaze of the room toward the top of the grand staircase. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. A woman stood at the top of the stairs. She was tall, statuesque. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged a body made of curves and steel. The dress was off the shoulder, revealing skin that glowed under the lights, creamy and flawless. A diamond choker, simple but devastatingly large, rested at her throat. Her hair, a rich chestnut cascade, was styled in loose, glamorous waves that framed a face of striking classical beauty. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like the owner of the building. She began to descend the stairs, slowly, with a grace that made Tiffany's earlier stumbling look like a toddler learning to walk. Every step was deliberate. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. Richard squinted. There was something familiar about the way she held her head, high, defiant. The arch of her brow. "Who is that?" Tiffany whispered, her voice laced with jealousy. "She looks old." "She looks expensive," Richard murmured, entranced. The woman reached the bottom of the stairs. Mrs. Van Doren was there instantly, practically bowing. The photographers who had been filtering out rushed back in, their cameras clicking furiously, a wall of noise that drowned out the music. The woman smiled at Mrs. Van Doren. It wasn't a shy smile. It was a smile of sharks. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The glass of champagne slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was sharp, but barely anyone noticed over the commotion. He knew that smile. He had seen a fainter, sadder version of it across the breakfast table for 20 years. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Tiffany looked at the broken glass, then at Richard's pale face. "Richard, what is it?" The woman turned. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room. They bypassed the billionaires, the celebrities, the royals. They locked directly onto Richard. The warmth left her eyes, replaced by a cool, amused recognition. She didn't wave, she simply nodded, a tiny regal acknowledgement of a servant. "That's Catherine," Richard choked out. Tiffany laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your ex-wife? The frumpy one you showed me pictures of? No way. That woman is a supermodel." "It's her," Richard said, his voice trembling. He took a step forward, driven by a mix of confusion and a sudden, primal instinct to claim what he thought he had discarded. But he was blocked. A wall of tuxedoed men, security, perhaps, or admirers, had already formed around her. And stepping out from behind her was a man Richard recognized with a jolt of terror. It was Sebastian Thorne. Not just a rival architect, but the head of the Pritzker Prize Committee, and a man Richard had been trying to get a meeting with for 5 years. Sebastian placed a hand on the small of Catherine's back, leaning in to whisper something that made her laugh, a throaty, confident sound that Richard had never heard before. "She's with Thorne," Richard whispered, horror dawning on him. Catherine Sterling had not just entered the room, she had invaded it. And judging by the way the crowd parted for her, she wasn't there for the charity. She was there for blood. "Richard!" Tiffany hissed, grabbing his arm as people started to stare at his frozen state. "Pick up your glass. You look like an idiot." But Richard couldn't move. He watched as his plain ex-wife, the woman he had left because she lacked ambition, walked toward the platinum table, the seat of power, and sat down at the head of it. She was the mystery donor. As she settled her velvet skirts, she looked over at Richard one last time. She raised her champagne flute in a mock toast. "Game on," her eyes said. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had brought a mistress to a gala. Catherine had brought an empire. Dinner was an ordeal. Richard was seated at table 12, a perfectly respectable table near the front, shared with a senator who drank too much scotch, and a tech CEO wearing sneakers with his tuxedo. Any other night, Richard would have dominated the conversation. Tonight, he couldn't take his eyes off the center of the room. Table 1, the platinum table, was elevated slightly on a dais. It was a throne room, and Catherine was holding court. Richard watched as men who wouldn't take his calls 3 months ago practically tripped over themselves to pay their respects to his ex-wife. They leaned in, laughing at her jokes, hanging on her every word. Catherine, who used to get flustered if the waiter recited the specials too quickly, was navigating the sharks of high society with terrifying ease. She was animated, using her hands to emphasize points, touching Sebastian Thorne lightly on the arm to draw him into conversations. Every movement was elegant, practiced. It was as if the dowdy housewife he'd known for 2 decades had been a cocoon, and this magnificent creature had just been waiting for the right temperature to emerge. Richie, stop staring at her. It's weird, Tiffany hissed, stabbing at her heirloom tomato salad. I'm not staring, Richard lied, turning back to his plate. The food tasted like cardboard. I'm just trying to figure out what game she's playing. She's just trying to make you jealous, Tiffany scoffed, flipping her hair. Look at her. It's all smoke and mirrors. She's probably wearing Spanx up to her neck and rented those diamonds. Richard looked back at Catherine. The diamonds caught the light with the unmistakable blue-white fire of the real thing. That necklace alone was worth more than Tiffany's entire existence. It's not jealousy, Tiff. You don't understand these people. Catherine hates attention. She hates crowds. For her to do this. He trailed off as Harrison Cole, the head of the city's zoning board, a man whose approval Richard desperately needed for a new skyscraper project, walked right past their table without a glance and headed straight for Catherine. Richard strained to hear. Catherine, my dear, Cole boomed. Sebastian tells me you have some fascinating ideas about the waterfront redevelopment. Catherine smiled, a genuine, intelligent smile. Harrison, good to see you. Yes, I think the current proposals are too industrial. We need green spaces that breathe. Sebastian and I were just discussing how to integrate sustainable materials without sacrificing the aesthetic. Fascinating, Cole murmured, pulling up a chair, completely oblivious to the actual seating chart. Tell me more. Richard felt a vein throb in his temple. The waterfront project? That was his territory. He'd been lobbying Cole for 6 months just to get a preliminary meeting. Catherine walked in off the street and had him eating out of her hand in 5 minutes. And then it hit him. The arrogance returned, a comforting blanket. She's doing this to get better alimony, he thought. Or she wants me back. This whole charade, the dress, the hair, cozying up to Thorne, it's all a performance for an audience of 1. Me. It was pathetically transparent once he thought about it. She was trying to show him what he was missing. Well, 2 could play at that game. He was Richard Sterling. He didn't cower. Excuse me for a moment, Richard said, tossing his napkin onto the table. Where are you going? Tiffany demanded, her voice rising to an embarrassing whine. They're about to serve the main course. Stay here, look pretty. I need to go handle something. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and began the long walk to the dais. He felt eyes on him. He knew people were whispering. There goes the ex-husband, the one who traded a diamond for a cubic zirconia. He ignored them. He approached the platinum table just as a waiter was pouring a vintage Bordeaux for Sebastian Thorne. Well, well, Richard said, pitching his voice to carry just enough over the din of the room. Quite a performance, Catherine. I didn't know you owned a dress that didn't have an elastic waistband. The conversation at the table died instantly. Harrison Cole looked uncomfortable. Sebastian Thorne set his wine glass down with a deliberate, heavy click, his expression darkening. But Catherine didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting Richard's. Up close, she was even more devastating. The makeup wasn't hiding wrinkles. It was accentuating bone structure he'd forgotten she had. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. Only a glacial calm. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice smooth and low, like good whiskey. "I see you brought your assistant." At table 12, Tiffany gasped audibly. "Cut the crap, Katie," Richard sneered, using a pet name he knew she despised. "What are you doing here? Who paid for all this? Did you blow your entire settlement on one night to impress me? Because honestly, it's a little sad." Sebastian Thorne started to rise out of his chair. "Now see here, Sterling, if you can't behave like a gentleman—" Catherine placed a restraining hand on Sebastian's arm. "It's all right, Sebastian. I can handle the help." Richard bristled. "Help? I built the company that paid for the roof over your head for 20 years. Catherine finally smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Richard, you really still don't get it, do you? You didn't build anything without me." Before Richard could retort, Tiffany materialized at his elbow. She had apparently decided that staying put wasn't in her job description. She latched onto Richard's arm, glaring daggers at Catherine. "Listen here, you old hag." Tiffany spat, her voice shrill and grating in the sophisticated quiet of the dais. "I don't know who you think you are, waltzing in here like you own the place. Richie chose me. You're just bitter because you're past your expiration date." The silence at the platinum table deepened. It was the kind of silence that precedes a public execution. Harrison Cole looked at his shoes. Even Mrs. Van Doren, who had drifted over to watch the fireworks, looked appalled by the vulgarity. Catherine looked at Tiffany not with anger, but with the mild curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly simple bacterium under a microscope. "And you are?" Catherine asked politely. "I'm Tiffany, his fiancée." She emphasized the word, thrusting her left hand forward to show off the engagement ring, a ring Richard had bought on a payment plan because his liquidity was tied up in the Dubai bid. "Ah, yes, the spin instructor," Catherine said, as if recalling a distant memory. Richard always did have a weakness for things that were loud, brightly colored, and easily replaceable. Tiffany spluttered, her face turning a blotchy red that clashed horribly with her sequined dress. "You—" "Tiffany, be quiet," Richard snapped, humiliated. He turned back to Catherine, his voice low and furious. "This is ridiculous. You're making a scene, Catherine. Go home to Connecticut before you embarrass yourself further." Catherine laughed then. It was a genuine laugh, rich and amused. She picked up her wine glass and stood up slowly. Even in heels, Richard was barely an inch taller than her now. She held herself with such immense gravity that she seemed to tower over him. "Home? Richard, I sold the Connecticut house months ago. Too much beige. You know how I hate beige." She took a sip of wine, watching him over the rim of the glass. "And as for embarrassing myself, I'm not the one who brought a child to an adult's table." "Damn it, Catherine, what do you want? Why are you here with Thorne? Are you sleeping with him to get back at me? Is that it?" Sebastian Thorne stood up now, his face thunderous. "That is enough, Sterling. Security." "No, Sebastian. Let him finish," Catherine said coolly. "He thinks the world revolves around his zipper. Let's disabuse him of that notion." She turned fully to Richard, her expression hardening into steel. "You asked what I'm doing here, Richard. I'm here working, just like everyone else." Richard frowned. "Working? You haven't worked a day since 1998, unless you count organizing the PTA bake sale." "That's what you chose to see," Catherine said. Her voice was quiet now, but it carried a weight that forced Richard to listen. You saw a housewife. You didn't see the person who proofread every single proposal you ever submitted. You didn't see the person who stayed up until 3 a.m. fixing the structural calculations on the Hudson Tower project because you were too drunk to notice the load-bearing errors. You didn't see the silent partner who managed your ego and cleaned up your messes for 2 decades. Richard felt a chill. He remembered those nights. He had always assumed. Well, he hadn't really thought about how those problems fixed themselves. He just assumed he was brilliant. "You're delusional," Richard blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Tell me, Richard, how is the Dubai bid going? The sustainable eco tower. I hear the client is very demanding about the environmental impact specs." Richard froze. The Dubai bid was top secret. Only his board and his lead architects knew about the specific environmental requirements. "How do you know about that?" Catherine smiled. And this time, it was the smile of the predator who has finally trapped its prey. "Because, my dear ex-husband, I am KS Architecture Solutions." Richard stared at her blankly. "Who?" Harrison Cole cleared his throat from the table. "Richard, KS Architecture. They're the new firm making waves all over Europe. They're the ones who just beat out your firm for the Berlin Philharmonic redesign last month." Richard felt the room spin. He remembered the Berlin loss. It had been devastating. A mysterious new firm out of nowhere had come in with a design that was innovative, breathtaking, and cheaper than his. "That was you," Richard whispered, horrified. "I used my divorce settlement as seed money," Catherine explained calmly. Sebastian was kind enough to recognize talent when he saw it and provided the initial VC backing. "It turns out, when I'm not busy folding your laundry and soothing your temper tantrums, I'm actually a very good architect. Better than you, in fact." She leaned in closer, her perfume, something complex with notes of vetiver and jasmine, not the floral talcum powder she used to wear, filling his senses. "And as for the Dubai project, the client is dining with me tomorrow morning. Sebastian introduced us." She gestured lightly to Sebastian, who nodded grimly. "We're presenting an alternative proposal, one that doesn't rely on cheap materials to cut costs, unlike Sterling and Hearth's current modus operandi." Richard looked from Catherine to Sebastian, then down at Tiffany, who was anxiously checking her phone, completely unaware that their lives were collapsing around them. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had created his own worst enemy, and he had handed her the capital to destroy him. "You can't do this," Richard choked out. "This is vindictive." "No, Richard," Catherine said, turning away from him to address the table again. "It's just business. Now, if you'll excuse us, Harrison and I were discussing green spaces. You and your fiancé should probably return to your table. I believe they are serving the sorbet." The morning after the gala, the sun over Manhattan didn't rise. It assaulted. Richard woke up with a headache that felt like a jackhammer was excavating his frontal lobe. He lay in the master bedroom of the penthouse, a room designed with minimalist, cold grey tones that Catherine had always said felt like sleeping in a bank vault. He rolled over, expecting the soothing scent of lavender and the quiet rustle of a newspaper. Instead, he was hit with the smell of stale hairspray and the sight of Tiffany, sprawled diagonally across the bed, snoring with her mouth open. Her false eyelashes were peeling off, stuck to her cheek like dead spiders. Richard felt a surge of revulsion so strong it nearly made him gag. He scrambled out of bed, grabbing his phone. The screen was lit up with notifications. None of them were good. "Beatrice, lawyer. Call me, now. The stock dropped 4% at opening. Rumours about the Dubai deal are leaking. Harrison Cole. Richard, we need to reschedule our lunch. Something has come up. Page 6. Ex-wife. Excellence. Catherine Sterling stuns at Met Gala, leaves mogul hubby in the dust. Richard hurled the phone onto the duvet. It bounced and hit Tiffany, who groaned and rolled over, muttering something about mimosas. "Get up!" Richard barked, marching into the bathroom. "Pack a bag. You're going to your mother's for a few days." "What?" Tiffany's voice was a groggy whine. "But we have reservations at Nobu tonight." "There is no Nobu. There is no dinner," Richard screamed, his composure fracturing. "My entire life is on the line, and you're worried about sushi? Get out!" He slammed the bathroom door, leaning against the cold marble. He needed to focus. The Dubai representative, Alexander Cross, was staying at the St. Regis. The meeting was scheduled for 10:15 a.m. Richard checked his watch. It was 8:45 a.m. He had time. He could still fix this. He was Richard Sterling. He could talk his way out of anything. 40 minutes later, Richard stormed into the lobby of the St. Regis. He looked impeccable in a navy Tom Ford suit, but his eyes were manic. He bypassed the front desk and headed straight for the King Cole Bar, where he knew Alexander Cross preferred to take his morning meetings. He stopped dead in the doorway. They were already there. In a quiet corner booth, bathed in soft morning light, sat Alexander Cross, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and hatred of wasted time. Opposite him was Catherine. She looked fresh, rested, and intimidatingly professional in a cream-colored power suit that made her look like the CEO of the world. On the table between them wasn't a napkin, sketch, or a tablet. It was a fully rendered 3D holographic projection of a tower, emanating from a small device Richard had never seen before. The tower was beautiful. It spiraled like a strand of DNA, draped in vertical gardens. It was organic, futuristic, and completely unlike the steel phallus Richard had designed. Richard smoothed his tie and walked over, forcing a smile that felt like it was made of broken glass. "Alexander, my apologies if I'm early," Richard boomed, pulling up a chair without being invited. Alexander Cross looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting you until 10. Catherine and I were just finishing up breakfast." "Catherine?" Richard nodded at her, his voice tight. "I see you're pitching. Isn't it a bit unethical to poach a client halfway through a negotiation?" Catherine took a sip of herbal tea. "There was no contract signed, Richard. Alexander was looking for innovation. I simply offered him an option." "An option?" Richard scoffed, gesturing at the hologram. "This? It's a fantasy, Alexander. Look at the structural load on those cantilevered gardens. The irrigation costs alone would bankrupt the project in 5 years. Catherine is a dreamer, not an engineer. She doesn't understand the logistics of a build this size." Catherine didn't get angry. She didn't defend herself. She simply tapped the table. "Page 42 of the proposal, Alexander," she said softly. Alexander Cross scrolled through the tablet in front of him. Self-sustaining grey-water recycling system. Solar glass cladding reducing energy costs by 40%. Structural integrity reinforced by carbon nanotube weaving. He looked up at Richard. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, her logistics are impeccable, and her projected maintenance costs are half of yours." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible. Carbon nanotube weaving? That technology is experimental. It's too expensive." "Not if you own the patent," Catherine said. Richard stared at her. "What?" "During the divorce," Catherine said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you fought for the penthouse, the cars, and the brand names Sterling and Hearth. You let me keep my silly little hobbies, as you called them. That included the small investment portfolio I managed. One of those investments was a startup in Zurich, developing construction materials. I bought them out 3 months ago. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. I own the supply chain, Richard. I can build this tower for 20% less than you because I don't have to buy the materials from a middleman. You do. The silence at the table was deafening. Alexander Cross closed the folder. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and dismissal. Richard, your design is classic. But the world is changing. Catherine's proposal is the future, and frankly, the numbers don't lie. Cross extended a hand to Catherine. We have a deal, Mrs. Sterling. I'll have my legal team draw up the papers by noon. Thank you, Alexander, Catherine said, shaking his hand firmly. You won't regret it. Richard sat there, frozen. He had just lost a $200 million contract before he had even ordered coffee. Alexander, wait, Richard stammered, desperation clawing at his throat. We can renegotiate. I can cut my fees. It's not about the fees, Richard, Cross said, standing up. It's about the vision. You're building for yesterday. She's building for tomorrow. Cross walked away, leaving the ex-husband and ex-wife alone in the booth. Richard turned to Catherine, his hands shaking. You planned this. You set me up. Catherine began packing up her holographic projector. I didn't set you up, Richard. I just stopped propping you up. There's a difference. I made you, Richard hissed, his voice rising, drawing stares from other tables. I took you out of that miserable suburb. I gave you a life. You gave me a cage, Catherine corrected, standing up. And you forgot one important thing about me, Richard. I have a master's degree in structural engineering from MIT. You have a bachelor's in architecture and a talent for sales. You were the face. I was the brain. You just never bothered to look behind the curtain because you were too busy looking in the mirror. She picked up her Hermes bag, a genuine Birkin, Richard noted with a pang of envy, and looked down at him. Oh, and Richard, check your email. My lawyers just sent a cease and desist regarding the Hudson Tower. The Hudson Tower? Richard blinked. That's my project. Is it? Catherine raised an eyebrow. Check the metadata on the original Caddy files. I drew the initial schematics on my laptop in 2019. You copied them onto your server. Under the terms of our intellectual property agreement, which you signed without reading because you were rushing to meet Tiffany, anything created by me prior to the divorce remains my property. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. I'm taking my building back. Have a nice day. The fall of Richard Sterling was not a slow decline. It was a cliff dive. By the time Richard got back to the offices of Sterling and Hearth on 57th Street, the chaos had already begun. The news of the Dubai loss had hit the wire. The stock was in freefall. He marched into his office, slamming the door so hard the glass walls rattled. Beatrice! He screamed into the intercom. Get in here! His lawyer entered, looking pale. She didn't sit down. It's bad, Richard, she said, bypassing the pleasantries. The bank called. The line of credit for the Hudson project was contingent on the Dubai contract securing our liquidity. With Dubai gone, they're freezing the accounts. They can't do that. Richard paced the room, running a hand through his perfectly gelled hair, ruining it. I am Richard Sterling. I have assets. Your assets are leveraged, Beatrice said bluntly, and we have a bigger problem. Catherine's cease and desist. It's a bluff, Richard scoffed, pouring himself a scotch. It was 11 Hochschubeauem. She's just trying to scare me. I had it check the server logs, Richard, Beatrice said quietly. She's right. The original files for the Hudson design have her user signature. If she sues, she wins. And she'll publicly reveal that the visionary design of Sterling and Hearth was actually done by your wife." Richard froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. That was the kill shot. His entire brand was built on his reputation as a singular genius. If it came out that Catherine was the talent, he wouldn't just lose money, he would lose his identity. "Fix it," Richard whispered. "Pay her off. Whatever she wants." "I called her counsel," Beatrice said, closing her folder. "She doesn't want money. She wants a public retraction. She wants you to admit in a press release that she designed the Hudson Tower." "Never," Richard snarled, hurling the glass against the wall. It shattered, amber liquid dripping down the expensive silk wallpaper. "I will burn this company to the ground before I admit that," Beatrice sighed. "Then you might get your wish." The final blow came from home. Richard didn't leave the office until midnight. He had spent 12 hours screaming at subordinates, trying to find a loophole, trying to find a new investor. But the smell of blood was in the water. No one would take his calls. He arrived at the penthouse, exhausted, defeated, needing someone to tell him he was still a king, even if that person was Tiffany. "Tiffany?" he called out, loosening his tie as he walked into the foyer. The apartment was eerily quiet. He walked into the living room. It was different, emptier. The abstract paintings, the ones he had bought to impress his art dealer friends, were gone. The sculptures were missing. He ran to the bedroom. The closet was open. Tiffany's side was bare. But it wasn't just her clothes. His watch collection was gone. The safe in the wall was open and empty. On the bed, where she had been sleeping that morning, was a note written on the back of a Nobu napkin. "Richie, saw the news on TMZ. Looks like you're broke." "Sorry, babe, but I can't do broke. My esthetician costs 2 KDOs a month. I took the watches and the cash in the safe as a severance package. Don't bother calling the cops. I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. You rat on me. I rat on you to the IRS. Good luck with the ex-wife. She seems scary. Tiff P.S. I'm taking the dog." Richard stared at the note. He didn't even care about the watches. He didn't care about the dog, a Pomeranian he secretly hated. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. The lights of Manhattan twinkled below him, indifferent to his ruin. Somewhere out there, in a better hotel suite, Catherine was probably toasting her victory with Alexander Cross. He had traded a partner for a parasite. He had traded a legacy for a midlife crisis. The elevator chimed. Richard turned, a flicker of hope igniting. Did Tiffany come back? Did Beatrice find a solution? The doors opened. It wasn't Tiffany. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, followed by the building's doorman, who looked apologetic. "Mr. Sterling," the taller suit asked. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, though his voice lacked its usual fire. "We're from the bank, sir," the man said, holding up a clipboard. "Since the accounts have been frozen, and the mortgage on this penthouse is in default, as of the margin call an hour ago, we're here to secure the asset." "You're evicting me?" Richard laughed, a dry, hysterical sound. "It's midnight. We're securing the property to ensure nothing else. Disappears," the man said, glancing at the empty spots on the walls where the art used to be. "You have 30 minutes to gather personal essentials and vacate the premises." Richard Sterling, the man who built the skyline, stood in the center of his empty, leased life. He had no wife. He had no mistress. He had no company. He had no home. He walked over to the side table where he had left his cufflinks the night before, the platinum ones Tiffany had given him. He picked them up. They felt light, cheap. He scraped the mother of pearl with his fingernail. It flaked off. Plastic. He dropped them into the trash can. 30 minutes, Richard said to the repo men. "Fine, it's plenty of time." 6 months later, the New York autumn had turned into a biting grey winter. Richard stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. It wasn't the cashmere trench coat he used to wear. That had been sold on eBay to pay off a tax lien. This was a wool blend he'd picked up at a discount outlet. It itched. He was standing outside the cordon of a construction site. The construction site. The hoardings were plastered with glossy renderings of the Helix, the revolutionary eco-tower that was set to redefine the city's skyline. The name at the bottom of the sign didn't say Sterling and Hearth. It said KS Architecture and Design. A crowd had gathered. News crews were setting up cameras. A podium was draped in blue velvet. Today was the groundbreaking ceremony. Richard wasn't on the VIP list. He wasn't even on the guest list. He was currently working as a freelance consultant for a firm in New Jersey that specialized in strip mall renovations. His days were spent arguing with contractors about the price of drywall for vape shops. He told himself he was just passing by. He told himself he didn't care. But when the black SUVs pulled up, his feet refused to move. First out of the car was Alexander Cross, looking pleased. Then came Sebastian Thorne, who was now a senior partner in the new venture. And finally, Catherine. She looked radiant. She wore a hard hat, but she made it look like a crown. She was laughing at something Sebastian said, her face relaxed and younger than he had seen it in years. Richard felt a pull in his chest, a hollow, aching void where his ego used to be. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the glares of tourists. "Catherine!" His voice was lost in the applause as the mayor took the podium. Richard shoved past a security guard who was distracted by a cameraman. "Catherine!" he shouted louder. This time she heard him. She paused near the VIP tent, turning her head. Her eyes scanned the crowd and landed on him. For a moment, she looked confused, as if trying to place a face from a long-forgotten high school reunion. Then, recognition dawned. She said something to Sebastian, who frowned and stepped forward protectively. Catherine shook her head, touching Sebastian's arm gently. She walked over to the barricade where Richard stood. She didn't cross the line. She stood just on the other side of the velvet rope, creating a physical barrier between his world and hers. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't cold anymore. It was indifferent. That was worse. "Kate," he breathed, using the name he hadn't used since they were dating. You look good." "I am good, Richard. I'm busy. We break ground in 10 minutes. What do you want?" Richard looked at her, searching for the needy, insecure woman he had divorced. She wasn't there. I wanted to say congratulations," he stammered. "It's a great design, the carbon weaving. It was smart." "I know," she said simply. "I also." He swallowed his pride, which tasted like ash. "I wanted to ask if you're hiring. I know the business inside out, Catherine. I know the city codes. I could handle the permits for you. I need a job. The New Jersey gig isn't working out." Catherine looked at him with a profound sadness. Not for herself, but for him. "You want a job?" she repeated. "I can be a consultant. Part-time. I won't cause trouble. I just need a foot back in the door. Sterling and Hearth is gone, Kate. The board dissolved it. I have nothing." He waited for her to gloat. He waited for her to tell him that he deserved it, that karma was a bitch, that she hoped he starved. That's what he would have done. Instead, Catherine opened her purse, not the Birkin this time, but a sleek, practical leather tote. She pulled out a business card. Richard's heart leaped. She was going to help him. She still cared. "Call this number," she said, handing him the card. Richard looked at it. It wasn't for KS Architecture. It was for a headhunter agency. They specialize in mid-level project management, Catherine said gently. They place people in firms that need site supervisors. It's honest work, Richard. You'd be good at it if you can learn to listen to the architects. Richard stared at the card. Project management? You want me to be a foreman? I was a CEO. You were a figurehead, Catherine corrected him, her voice hardening slightly. And you weren't a very good one. You burned every bridge you walked across because you liked the smell of the smoke. I can't hire you, Richard. My team respects me. Bringing you in would be an insult to them. She took a step back. But surely, for old times' sake, Richard pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. 20 years, Catherine. Doesn't that mean anything? Catherine looked at the construction site, then back at him. It means everything, she said. Those 20 years taught me exactly what I'm worth. And they taught me exactly what you are. I spent 2 decades making you look tall, Richard. I'm done stooping. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the lead architect, Catherine Sterling, the loudspeaker boomed. It's Catherine Thorne now, actually, she said to Richard, a small smile playing on her lips. I kept the name for business for a while, but Sebastian and I are making it official next month. Richard felt the ground beneath him sway. You're marrying him? He listens to me, Richard. He reads my notes, and he takes his coffee black, just like I do. She checked her watch. I have to go. Goodbye, Richard. Try the number. Ask for David. He's very helpful. She turned around. She didn't look back. She walked toward the podium, toward the applause, toward the man who adored her, and toward the skyline she was about to rebuild. Richard stood alone on the sidewalk. The wind picked up, blowing a discarded newspaper against his leg. He looked at the business card in his hand. Mid-level project management. He crumpled the card in his fist and dropped it into the gutter. I don't need her help, he muttered to himself, adjusting his cheap coat. I'm Richard Sterling. I'll be back on top in no time. He turned and walked away, heading toward the subway station, while behind him, the crowd cheered for the woman he had called plain. He didn't notice the rain starting to fall, washing the crumpled card down the drain, right along with the last remnants of his pride. The story of Richard and Catherine isn't just a tale of a messy divorce. It's a reminder that in life, and in business, we often undervalue the very things that keep us standing. Richard saw Catherine as a depreciating asset, something plain and utilitarian that he had outgrown. He failed to realize that she was the foundation. And as any architect knows, when you remove the foundation to focus on the facade, the whole house comes crashing down. Richard spent his life chasing the shiny, the new, and the superficial, believing that his image was his power. In the end, he was left with nothing but his reflection in a puddle, while the plain ex-wife he discarded built a monument to her own resilience that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Wow, talk about a reality check. Richard really learned the hard way that you never, ever underestimate the person who knows where all the bodies are buried, or in this case, the person who did all the math. What do you guys think? Did Richard deserve to lose everything, or was Catherine a little too harsh at the end? And seriously, have you ever seen a glow-up revenge quite like that? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We post new drama every Tuesday and Friday. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you step on your way up, because you might meet them on your way down.